Hey there, players of all classes. I'm back with another supplements, but before I start the episode or anything, I just want to share. I'm finally doing it. Look at this. Look at this. Look at this. I'm wearing my own merch. Let's go. You too can own some merch for the channel and DM Roundtable related stuff if you check out our Redbubble shop, which is always linked in the description below. Always. But now we're here for the main event. Do you know what we're talking about today? Today we're talking about Kibbles' crafting guide. And these are material cards, which I will come to eventually. Kibbles Tasty is a homebrew creator that I'm sure a lot of you have come across his stuff before. He's got tons and tons of stuff out there. There is a much bigger crafting and other stuff compendium that he released as part of a Kickstarter, but he also released some standalone books. One of which is the crafting guide, which is pretty much all of the crafting information as part of the compendium just put into one book so you can take it out separately. As you can see, I've tabbed many things in here. So, what exactly do you get in here? Kibbles made a whole system that is simple but could be challenging in order to make it so that crafting, harvesting, that kind of stuff makes sense within the game, because there are tons of times where in the books it'll say like, oh, you can make a potion of healing, you can make this, but they never explain how. That's never explained. So I've spent a lot of time going through stuff that I've come across and being like, oh, I would love it if my players could do this. I would love it if my players could do that. Why is there no system built in to make that? If you've already started a 5e game and you're adding this in now, it might be a little bit more difficult if you've got people like druids and rangers, or even artificers, or if you want to use Kibbles's, he's got classes too that are built to specifically use this, like the Inventor, which is a kind of like a remake of the Artificer. If you've already had those kind of characters in your campaign, even to some regards a wizard, it might be hard to slot these ideas into the campaign without your players being like, why have you never told me this before? Unless you're really low level and they've never really understood it. Like, my characters are in tier 2 right now. If I slid in a lot of these ideas, especially considering some of their backstories, they would be like, what the hell? Why don't I know how to do this? And it's not like my version of the Blood Hunters that I run in my campaign, which are kind of like Witchers. It is stuff that pretty much everybody should know. So I would say if you intend to use the tenets that are provided in Kibbles' crafting guide, probably start your campaign with them, or introduce a character that is specifically knowledgeable about these kind of things. Because when I say crafting and you see this dwarven blacksmith, it's not just blacksmithing. There's also alchemy, there's poison making, there's item making, leatherworking, foraging are all concepts presented in this book right here. And to be fair, everything presented in this book, you don't necessarily have to be a certain class or anything. All these things are supposed to be stuff that anybody, as long as they have the correct tools on them, can work on. And that is very important, that anybody who has tools that are proficient with specific tools can build, can work on things. And for the most part, you would do this during your regular downtime. Kibbles makes a big point being that he doesn't want time constraints to be problematic for your players. Like, he doesn't want them to spend their whole time blacksmithing. He doesn't want them to spend their whole time foraging. So a lot of the rules are based on Kibbles' own camp actions, which are essentially, if your players are making a long rest, if they're making camp, you're supposed to be down for 8 hours. But for 2 out of those 8 hours, you can go do things that wouldn't necessarily tire you out. So you can work on potions, you can work on scrolls, you can work on things like that without tiring your character out. So camp actions are 2-hour blocks, and that is how the time is built in for everything. However, you can say different things. It's your game. You don't have to run them as the camp actions with you completing tasks in 2-hour blocks. You could be like, oh, my players have downtime today. They're going to go work on something. They can totally do that. And even in this book, it's like, oh, it may take such and such amount of hours to complete this, but it will also take, if you want to do it elsewhere, this many work days, which is an 8-hour day straight up of doing that. One of the big things you also need to understand about this particular setup is that you can fail on the way. in addition to you failing along the way and having to restart your progress, Kibbles also makes it clear that a lot of these things that you're doing, you're going out of your way to do, may in fact be easier just to go out and buy. So he provides like the basic price tables for things, but also items that you're making or paying for, they have a set price of like what a regular person would reasonably pay within the world of 5e in order to get this item handed to them, rather than you going out and making it yourself. I also want to stress that I personally am not going to use every rule in this book for how to make things, because my campaign's ongoing. Maybe if I started a new campaign, I would include things in here at the beginning so that my players would know about it. But like my current ongoing campaign, some of these things don't fit in based on stuff that I already have going. A big part of this is that you can now get loot. There's tons of loot tables in here for getting like reagents and materials out of stuff instead of just regular items or gold. And you need reagents, you need essences, you need bits and bobs, like parts of things, in order to make new items. So those are entirely new sets of items that your players can grab and then use those parts to make something new out of them. Introducing a lot of these tenets now is going to be very difficult for my campaign. So if you want to use these rules in your campaigns, establish them early on so it's not like a lot extra added to your world that your players will be like, why didn't I know that before? And I also understand if your players are not like that. Mine 100% are. If your players are not like, oh, you didn't tell me this before, how dare you? You can add them to your campaign. No sweat. Your players will be like, oh, a new system for me to learn. Sure. My players are not like that. My players are 100% not like that. Of the reagents, so those are things that you're going to need for completing alchemy and stuff like that. There's curative, which would be parts that you would essentially use to make healing potions and other things like that. There's poisonous reagents, which are if you're building poisons, because there are a ton of new poisons in this book. The third one is reactive. So like if you want something to happen, usually you'd use a reactive reagent within that potion or that item. Then there's magical ink. If you're using the basic spell scribing rules, you probably won't need to use the crafting spell scrolls section in this book. You can just skip over that one. And then there's essences, which you can pull out of creatures or magic items or things. And for those, there are arcane, divine, and primal, which is kind of like the 2024 setup, even though this book came out before the 2024 rules. Then there's ingots, which are if you're grabbing metal, you need ore and sort of stuff like that. You can use those in order to build metal items like armor and weapons. There's also leathers and hides. You can harvest. You can use the tools within this book to gather the hides and even some organs from other creatures, which you can use to build your own stuff, which makes total sense. Very Monster Hunter-ish, but way more simplified than Monster Hunter type rules. Wood is also a big component in these, and you can get all different kinds of wood, which will help you build bigger and better things depending on how rare, how exotic, how good this wood is. For the most part, I'm just going to be like, yo, chop down a tree. I'm not worried about how exotic this wood is. Now, the way that harvesting specifically from creatures is broken down in this book, it's kind of like you're doing it by type, and then you get specific parts based on what kind of creature you're pulling it out of. Or, you know, if you want human leather, like that one adventure we went through, you can do that too, I guess. If you are big on your characters, especially if they're rangers or druids, foraging in the woods, there are entire lists of what you can find within this book in certain biomes. And there's like named flora that you can go out and grab. I love that idea because I feel like that's something that's missing from baseline 5e as a whole. There are tons and tons of supplements that'll be like, this is how you go out and foraging, because it's something that makes sense for a ranger and a druid to do, but it's never really described beyond like feats or class traits that are like, oh, you can always find food in the wild, but nobody ever like goes in depth on it. Kibbles does for sure. The first new thing in here for crafting is Alchemy. And within Alchemy, you get reagents and you can build up potions. And it's not just the potions that are presented in the PHB or the DMG. There's a whole bunch of new extra potions. So within this book itself, there's information and items from Kibbles himself, from the Dungeon Strugglers, from the Arena Guy, and there's stuff from Griffin's Saddlebag, which is super cool that they're all condensed into this one book. You can get information about all that stuff right here, right in one place, and even how to build it. If any of those items appear in this book, there's one section at least where they describe how you can make them on the go rather than finding them in the wild. There's also tons of new types of items, like there's oils, as opposed to just the regular oil that you throw on and then can set on fire. Like there's flame tongue oil and frost oil, which you can pour on something to make that item take on a new property, which is super cool. And of course, there's how to make it in this book. Also, there's a new class of, they're essentially still potions, but they're specifically alchemical. There's concoctions, which all have some crazy effect. And then there's more explosives that you can use, which is pretty cool. There's a whole section on Poisoncraft as part of Alchemy, which lets you make the poisons. It even gives you ideas for how you can go out and harvest them from certain creatures in order to make new kinds of poisons, which is super cool because honestly, Poisoncraft as a whole, unless you're a drow, like almost nobody cares about it. And you should, because poison is pretty powerful. Granted, it is the most resisted damage type in the game, I believe, but still, poisoning someone can definitely give you a leg up on the competition. There is a whole section on here on blacksmithing. You could probably guess that from the Dwarven Blacksmith on the cover. But building weapons and armor, and then it has some extra systems, not all of which I would include, where you can like change the properties of your weapons and armor and give them new properties. They might be a little hard to explain to players if your campaign's already going. But one of the things in here is also maintain gear, where if your character knows how to use a forge, knows their way around a hammer and anvil, they can make sure that their armor is so well maintained that it gets a buff, and the same with their weapons. Like, oh, they make it optimally sharp, and that gives that weapon a buff for a little bit. There's a whole section on cooking, which is another thing that D&D talks about but never really explains. But the cool thing about the cooking stuff here is, yes, you can forage for flora and fauna, you can make your stuff, but your chefs, your cooks in the group can be so good at cooking that not only does this meal provide sustenance, but there's a whole list of new meals or types of meals that you can provide to a group or your whole party that will actually give them buffs during their adventures. Again, very Monster Hunter-y, but way more simplified in this book. Listen, if you're into Monster Hunter, you're probably going to like this book. In addition to rations, which will provide one character sustenance for a day, there's also snacks here, which will give you some, they're magical snacks. They're going to give you some ability, like really hot, spicy jerky that lets you breathe fire. And then there's other items in here. Seeing sticks, which give you blind sight for a little while, but they taste horrible. There's a big thing in here where in order to make your crafting rolls easier, because some things that you want to craft will be super, super difficult. Kibbles calls it taking 10, but it's basically doubling the time it takes you to add progress to something that you're crafting or making via alchemy or harvesting, that kind of thing. So some of the things may be super, super difficult, and you're basically only going to be able to complete them if you double the time it takes. Like you're spending your time extremely, extremely carefully to make sure that everything goes correctly. There's a whole section in this book on enchanting, which is basically taking a mundane item and then making it special, which are a lot of the wondrous items. And there's rules in here for how to build them, which I think is super cool. Again, I'm probably not going to take exactly the rules here in my ongoing campaign, but you can do whatever you want. And it's not just for items. There's also weapons and armor that you can make now. If you know how to build them, if you have the recipe, boom, you can go out, seek out those parts, build the item yourself instead of wandering the world trying to find one that already exists. There are a couple references in this book to psionics, which is, we'll say, an oft-forgotten part of 5e, because psionics have existed in previous editions. I will say it's 2024 rules that are trying to bring psionics back, but Kibbles has an entire class separate that he has made that is the Scion in 5e, and there are a lot of things specifically related to that class in this book. So if you're not running that class specifically, you can tweak those to maybe be related to something else like gem dragons or the new psionic classes that were presented in 2024 rules. It doesn't necessarily have to be his. They may reference things specifically, but hey, you can do what you want to make it fit into your world. Or you can just omit them completely. You don't have to fit them in. There's a section in this book on Scrollscribing. I personally am not going to use these rules in my book because we use the default rules where, you know, someone writes down the formula for the spell and puts it on. I also personally, in my world, don't subscribe to the rules as written where you can only cast spells if you have the scroll from your own class list. I think it's silly that people are writing these scrolls, but only certain people can use them. Because if you have a magic item that does that, it still works. It's technically the same thing. Someone's written that out. It might be easier for someone to read a spell in their class table and understand the formula because it's described to them in a way that they understand, but you can still do it. I still keep if it's higher level than what you can currently cast, you have to roll a DC check to make sure that you don't mess it up and it fails. But I let people of any class read a spell scroll and use it because the magic is there. The magic is already there. You wrote it with magical ink. You wrote the formula. Someone just has to figure it out. There is a section here, speaking of magical items that cast spells, on wand whittling. So you can make a wand that does a thing. And in this book, they separate wands into two categories. There's lesser wands and there's greater wands. Greater wands are, generally speaking, what you think of when you find a wand, like a wand of pyrotechnics or a wand of magic missile that recharges over time. And lesser wands are just like, I built this wand to do one thing. I don't have the magic know-how to make sure that this recharges itself. So once it's used up, it'll either crumble or someone can again perform a ritual to put the spells back into it so that someone can cast it later. Almost like a ring of spell storing sort of idea. But the lesser wands are, of course, way cheaper to produce and to purchase than a greater wand would be. Then there's a whole section on leatherworking, and this also includes carapace and like hides of much bigger creatures like scale and stuff if you're going after dragons and what have you, because this is a whole thing that nobody really talks about. And then one of the last sections is tinkering. It's for all those random miscellaneous objects that you might be building in your adventures. So stuff like lanterns and adventuring gear, other stuff like that, bedrolls and what have you. But this also includes building tools and instruments. So there's rules and parts in here for how to make those, because for the most part, I don't think I've ever heard of anyone being like, oh yeah, I made myself a set of thieves tools. Did you? How did you? What did you make? I don't understand. But Kibbles has rules for that. And then there's special ammunition. There's a whole like section on different types of special ammunition. Plus prosthetics. A whole section on prosthetics. Ranging from just basic, hey, it serves the purpose of your limb. It's not as great, but it serves the purpose, to very specialized ones that have like weapons built in. Like you go, and then all of a sudden there's a blade in your arm and you're cool as hell. Maybe it was worth losing your arm to that Ankeg. Then, near the end of the book, we come to a section that I personally have some skin in the game for, and that is runecrafting. However, the way that Kibbles does runecrafting, it is pretty close to the runecrafting stuff that I use in my campaign, starting with the giant ones, and then the tweaks that I gave out for the first year of DM Roundtable's anniversary, versions of stuff that we looked over before. They're pretty close because there is an effect for armor and weapons. But the way that Kibbles separates how to make runes is that they're based on two different traditions. So there's ancient traditions, which are runes that are made by like dragons and giants. So creatures that have had a very, very long history. I guess technically you could put elves in there. And then there's arcane tradition runes, which are ones that are like taught in schools. Now, since I'm using racial runestones already, I will have to tweak these a little bit further, but I do like the idea that they exist here. And I'm thinking maybe Kibbles also helped out with Kalia's Chronicles of Runes, but maybe he didn't. Maybe everyone just happened to get to the same place at roughly the same time. You know what I mean? All of Kibbles' runes, not only is there a different version if they're on weapons versus armor, but there's also a passive and an active effect for each of the runes. So they're all pretty powerful as compared to some of the other stuff that I'm using in my campaign or that I've shared with you guys. And then the last section of crafting is engineering. And this is specifically how to build buildings, how to build siege weapons. And while I probably won't use these rules as written because I've already got stuff, especially using stuff from Strongholds and Followers, which we've gone over in supplementals before, there are some pretty cool things in here that I will definitely at least take some of the rules for in my currently running campaign. The engineering also brings up an important point in that you don't usually, like, it's not one person who's building a house, generally speaking, or one person working on a siege weapon. It introduces the concept of laborers, and the more laborers you have, obviously the quicker things go, but there's a distinction between like general manual labor person and skilled laborer. That's someone who like knows what they're doing. That can also change the speed of your work progress. And then there's a little bit of a section on stuff that there are tools for, but nobody ever really goes into detail on what those things can build. So within this book, there's weaving, cobbling, masonry, glass blowing, painting, brewing. I really like that there is a section on brewing. Now you can make your own alcohol in your game. Jewel crafting, carpentry, and tailoring all have their own little sections in here which you can do with their tools. One thing that is strange to note is that tailoring uses weaver's tools because there is no tailoring set as an item. You totally could, even Kibbles says this, you totally could make a set of tailor's tools, but why bother when you've already got weavers? You might as well just use what you've got. As far as the appendixes at the end of this book go, there's some appendixes here for how to calculate how much a new item would cost. There's also stuff at the beginning of the book to have like a basic gist of that. Then there's the appendix on detailed names if you want people to be grabbing essences or reagents or looking up flora and fauna in specific biomes. There's a whole section for this where you can tell your players exactly what they're harvesting, exactly what they're gathering, if your people are into that. For the druids in your party, they're probably going to care about what flora is there. And by druids in your party, I also mean you, DM Shin. And then there are specific names for the meals you could be cooking if you've harvested parts and meat from very specific animals. The very first one I get a big kick out of because the creature is ape, and it's, should we eat this? Sliced roast. And then there's a whole section on variant rules if you want to add these to your game. Nobody says that you have to, but these are things that Kibbles decided to include just in case you want to use them, like trading in experience for making items or making essences, making reagents, which is something you would have done in very, very old editions of D&D, where like your gold was your experience, so you had to choose where to place it in yourself or in new items, that kind of thing. Then there's the recipes system, which honestly makes a ton of sense to include no matter what. It's just like, oh, do you know how to build this? Can you build this? Sure. But that also means maybe your character will be like, take some time during their downtime to be like, oh, I wonder if I could possibly maybe get, how would I build this? The coming up with a recipe, the coming up with a blueprint for something is something I feel like Grimalkin in my campaign, GrimJak's character, would probably like to have. Like, oh, I wonder if I can build this. How would I build it? Oh, wait, I'll come up with a blueprint. Now I know what I'm doing. And then the second to last appendix in here is how camp works. What Kibbles calls camp actions, so those 2-hour blocks that you can take that won't necessarily mess you up, like they won't grant you exhaustion if you go out and do something afterwards. detailed at the end of this. This was part of another supplement that Kibbles had released at some point, and apparently he uses camp actions pretty regularly. So I'm happy it was in here, because I didn't like at the beginning of the book when they're like, oh, if you're using camp actions, which are detailed blah, 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 blah. And I was like, what does that mean? Tell me about it. I mean, you get the basic gist. You have those 2 hours. But at the end, this is what camp actions is in Kibbles' world. And then he's got some spells added into the back of the book that help you do things crafting-wise. Like there's a new spell called Forge Fire, which essentially lets you turn a campfire's heat into the heat necessary that a forge would need in order to start crafting things, to start doing blacksmithing, to start doing alchemy, that kind of stuff, which is super cool. And then he's got Unseen Crafter, which is sort of like Unseen Servant, except you spawn a laborer, and this laborer will help you build things. A little weird that it's Unseen Crafter, because like it's probably difficult to, you know, build a building if you can't see what that one person is doing. I mean, you can see them lifting tools and stuff. You know that tool is moving, but there's a being there. You just can't see it. That must be super weird. And there's a couple items that are specifically related to stuff that happen in the game. Like you get a tanning bag that just automatically tans things. A tool belt that you can use Conjure Tool, which is another spell that Kibbles has, where you can just pull a tool set out of thin air. Be like, oh, I need this tool set. Whoop, here it is. And then the last page is a materials page that tells you your crafting stuff, like what materials you're holding on to, what crafted items you've actually completed. It's a character sheet, but it's like an extra page for your character sheet if your character is really into crafting. And finally, as a supplement to the supplement, we have the material cards. And within the material cards, I actually separated them already because they don't come in order in their little package, which is very, very weird. But you have alchemy reagents, and for the most part, they come in order of like common and then uncommon and then rare and then very rare and then legendary. But the alchemy ones are broken up into the curatives, the poisonous, the reactive, and then there's a mithril if you're pouring it into your stuff. And at the bottom there, you can write in like how much you have, what you're using it for. There's little sections. I don't know how many of these material cards I'm actually going to hand out to my players, but it's cool that they're included if you're going to use this system as is. Next up, you have components, and these are very specific pieces of components because a lot of the stuff is you're building like crossbows and things like that. And when you go to build a crossbow, you probably need the haft. Like you need that specific piece of wood in order to make it function properly. Then you have cards for your cooking supplies. So if your characters want to cook, if they want to make a feast for the party, you can hand them stuff if they've harvested parts from a creature. Then you have your enchanting essences. So this is arcane. The arcane ones are blue. The divine ones are yellow. And the primal ones are orange. Then you have your vials. Your vials let you hold things. You know, if you're making a potion, you're probably going to need something to put it in. So that's what the vials are for. These are all your scraps. They all have the picture of like boots on them, but this one's carapace. It's not quite the same. They're all things that you could harvest in order to make things for your player characters. One section that I use already, but not necessarily the way Kibbles does, is magical ink. There's magical ink cards in here. You have your metal items, so like scraps and ingots are in here, and then special materials. Next up is parchments. I don't necessarily think you need special parchment in order to write, because it's realistically, it's the magical ink that's doing all the heavy lifting. I don't know if I'm going to make my players go get exotic parchment for any reason other than to send a really nice letter to someone. You know what I mean? Big long section of tinkering parts. This is if you're going to build small bits and bobs or toys and stuff. You're going to need tinkering parts like gears and wires and coils and stuff like that. And then the last section is wooden parts. So if you need to build a bow or you want to build a staff or a wand, you're going to need different types of wood. And those are all the material cards included. So, who am I recommending this for? If you've got players in your campaign that really love harvesting, they want to forage, they really like Monster Hunter, this is the kind of supplement that those players will love to play. If your players are just like, I want to make a thing, and you just need some basic rules on how long it might take in order to make said thing, this could also help you. You don't have to use the rest of the rules there. If your players love the idea that they're going to spend, if they have a lot of downtime, that they're going to spend some time just working on things, making something their own instead of going out into the world and buying it or finding someone else who can do it, this is a great supplement for those kind of campaigns. Again, I must stress, a lot of the systems presented in here are going to be very difficult to slide into a campaign that's already been running for a while, where you've established basically things get made and stuff. Like this hunting and foraging system, this harvesting system, it's going to be difficult to explain to a party that has basically been doing that for however long they've been adventuring, and then being like, oh, here's some real in-depth rules. Again, if you have players like mine, it's not going to work as is to slot into a campaign that's already running, because the players are always like, but I did this before. I've already worked on things like that. How dare you give me new rules? If your players are just like, yo, I've done this before, but I want to know exactly how I did it. Can you explain to me in detail? Then for sure slot this in. Or if you can slide an NPC in there that has extreme knowledge, intimate knowledge of these kind of things, to be like, oh, this is how we're going to do it. You can totally do that. Like the blacksmithing section in here, GrimJak's character, is trying to learn to blacksmith. I can now be like, shwup, here's some easy blacksmithing rules. Instead of, so far in the campaign, he has spent 1 hour trying to figure out how to make a forge burn at the correct temperature. And after I think he failed like 3 checks, and then the 4th check, he got it right. He was like, cool, so I know how to blacksmith now. And me and all my other players at my table were like, there's no way you could learn how to blacksmith in its entirety in 1 hour, especially considering you failed like 3 times along the way. My guy, you have so much more work to do, but this will at least help in that regard. Yep, you players of all classes enjoyed what you saw. Leave a like. If you want to see more content like this, sub, and I will see you all in the next one. Now, I would never force anyone to do this, but if you would like to support me monetarily and you are capable of doing so, please, I'm never going to force you to do this. And if you don't have the means currently, that is totally fine. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. But if you would like to support me monetarily, you can become a YouTube member, which will get you early access to videos. And depending on what tier you're at, it can also get you access to my D&D BGM list. We may not share exactly the same music library, but I've got a list of songs that I would use in TTRPGs and why to use them. And listen, YouTube, Spotify exists. You can find the vast majority of that music on your own. Now you have a reason to play it, plus access to my D&D homebrew repository. Now, most of this guide is items and stuff like that, crafting rules. That's not in the repository. The repository is more a collection for DMs and players who want to add new things to their characters. So stuff like classes and races and subclasses and spells are in there, because those are all things that a player might use. Some of the spells in this book did make it into the repository. Not all of them, but some of them. You can also become a patron on Patreon, and there is a free tier on Patreon, which will at least alert you when I'm posting things. A lot of the posts I make are open to everyone, but some of them are for different tiers. Again, not forcing anyone to do that, but you can totally do that. Or you can go to the Redbubble shop and get some sweet merch for the channel and DM Roundtable and just TTRPGs in general. Any of that is super greatly appreciated. And I will say for sure that I'm not stealing your info or anything like that. Like if you order something on Redbubble, I can't see who bought it. I can only see what currency you paid in. And that's it. So that's all the information I will have. Now, I'm pretty sure you can guess, being that we just finished this, that the next thing we're going to take a look at is the standalone Psionic book from Kibbles, because that's what we're going to take a look at next.